Thank you for joining us as we explore one of the most unsettling instances in American history. Because this story will challenge your preconceived notions about appearances and trust, please let us know in the comments where you are viewing. One name has been purposefully removed from official documents. A lady whose brutality was so systematic that even historians would rather forget about her. We are discussing Deborah Kearns, the housekeeper who turned residences in rural West Virginia into scenes of. The final decades of the 19th century were a time of silent horror. The mist-covered mountains of the Appalachian area have long kept mysteries. Deborah came to Greenbrier County in 1876, but no one knew exactly where she had come from. She was 34, claimed to be a widow, and had apparently flawless letters of recommendation. The wealthiest families in the area required someone to take care of their properties while they were away on business or traveling. Deborah provided just that effectiveness, discretion, as well as a remarkable ability to maintain order. West Virginia was still getting over the horrors of the Civil War at that time. Governesses like Deborah had positions of significant authority in the strict hierarchy that governed rural estates. In addition to managing staff, supplies, and home finances, they frequently possessed greater authority than the owners who were not there. For someone who wanted complete control without continual oversight, it was the ideal job. Deborah's early. The county had a stellar reputation throughout those years. On the banks of the Greenbrier River, she was employed at the Riverside Estate, a cattle ranch. She was loved by the owner family. Under her direction, everything went smoothly. The accounting records were consistently flawless. The residents kept an almost militaristic order, and the staff never voiced complaints. But all of this perfection had an odd quality. It was unnaturally silent. The first cracks started to show up in 1881. Thomas Whitfield, an employee, vanished without a trace. Deborah told the owners that he had stolen some silverware and disappeared during the night. The narrative made sense. In that hilly area, where possibilities were few and temptations were strong, it was not unusual for workers to flee. Nobody questioned it. Nobody looked into it. In the local records, Thomas simply vanished. 2 years later, Mary Sullivan, a cook, took over. According to Deborah, the woman had gone back to Boston to take care of ailing family members. Once more, the explanation made sense. Back then, communications were slow. As life required, people vanished and then reappeared. However, no one who knew Mary ever saw her again, and she never sent a letter or news. No one had yet to notice the pattern that was beginning to take shape. West Virginia was huge. People were frequently engulfed by the mountains, and Deborah consistently provided convincing justifications. The other staff members revered her and even frightened her. On the properties where she worked, her word was law, and she was fully aware of how to use that authority. Deborah relocated further south to Ashwood Estate, a stately estate in Monroe County, in 1885. Her previous employers enthusiastically recommended her to the Harrison family. They wanted a business manager to oversee a workforce of 12 workers while they were in Charleston for extended periods of time. Deborah took on the task with her usual effectiveness. Everything appeared to be back to normal for the first few months. However, that strange quiet came back to Ashwood's hangover. The workers started to exhibit a fear that transcended professional deference. They never questioned Deborah's directives, avoided looking directly at her, and spoke in whispers when she wasn't present. In the neighborhood taverns, there were tales of severe punishments and of people who just vanished after arguing with the housekeeper. However, they were really hearsay, tales from agricultural laborers who had had a few beers. No influential person listened to such type of conversation. Deborah Kearns' true nature was concealed. In the frightened eyes of her subordinates, in the closed basement, and in fabricated ledgers. We are just starting to uncover the secrets she concealed for so long. She had created an ideal system of fear and control, shielded by the respectability of her position and the blind faith of the families who employed her. Nearly 15 kilometers from the closest town, Ashwood Estate was tucked away among forested hills. With towers on the sides and massive, intimidating Victorian design, the two-story mansion. Windows that appeared to keep an eye on the surroundings. For someone like Deborah to work unhindered, it was the ideal environment. The Harrison family only stayed there for 3 months out of the year, leaving the maid to handle everything else. There was a clear shift in Ashwood during the hard winter of 1886. Locals started to notice that the agricultural laborers had stopped showing up at church festivals and town fairs. In the past, it was typical to see known people at community events. However, there was an odd void now. Deborah was always prepared with a response when someone asked about a certain employee. They had either chosen to follow different courses, returned to their hometowns, or departed for other chances. Among the first to voice their concerns in public was Reverend Samuel Pierce. He maintained thorough parishioner records and saw that at least 7 individuals associated with Ashwood had vanished from Sunday services without saying goodbye. In a religious group that was so close-knit, this was exceptional. When Deborah, greeted him with courteous indifference when he attempted to discuss it, explaining that workers were free to come and go as they wished. The Reverend was unable to refute such obviously sound reasoning. However, one worker saw everything with increasing dismay. He was a blacksmith named Jacob Winters, and he worked on the estate, taking care of the agricultural machinery and animals. Jacob was somewhat independent from Deborah because he had a workshop apart from the main house, direct command. He heard talks he shouldn't have heard, saw things others didn't see, and started to put the pieces together to create a horrifying picture. Jacob saw that Deborah kept a lockable black notebook in her own office. He detected a pattern when he repeatedly observed her taking notes in this notebook following heated discussions with staff members. In the ensuing weeks, people whose names appeared in those pages tended to vanish. This was no accident. It was, too, systematic and overly predictable. In a frantic attempt to record what he was seeing, Jacob started writing his own covert notes, noting names and dates. Ellen Crawford, a maid, made the error of openly challenging the estate's accounting in the spring of 1887. She had access to the supply records because she worked in the kitchen. Ellen saw some serious differences. Wages paid to workers who were purportedly no longer employed there. Food bought for 12 individuals but only consumed by 7. Costs that were completely illogical. The housekeeper assured her that she would verify the numbers and fix any mistakes when she quietly confronted Deborah. 3 days later, Ellen vanished. Deborah told the others that the young woman had fled without even collecting her final paycheck after receiving important news from her relatives in Pennsylvania. There were clear flaws in the story. Ellen had often stated that she had no surviving family in Pennsylvania and that she would never leave money behind, given her unstable financial situation. However, no one dared challenge Deborah's official account. Fear tightened Jacob Winters' chest. He was aware that his name would ultimately appear in that black notebook if he continued to live in Ashwood. He chose to take a chance. Taking his notes to the county authorities, he would escape throughout the night. To disobey someone with Deborah's power was risky, but to keep quiet was to be participating in something really evil. Early in the morning in June 1887, Jacob tidied up his horse and collected his necessities. He intended to travel to the sheriff's office in Union, the county seat of Monroe County, with his notebook concealed inside his shirt. He was adamant despite the roughly 30 kilometers of treacherous routes that wound across the highlands. Early in the morning, while the fields were still shrouded in a spectral veil of fog, he left the workshop. Deborah was anticipating. She had detected Jacob's restlessness, his intense looks, and his mounting anxiety. Nothing evaded her notice. When Jacob attempted to get by her, she was standing on the back porch with a light that created warped shadows on the house's walls. For a deadly moment, Jacob was frozen by the intensity with which his eyes mirrored the flame. There was never a clear explanation of what transpired during that evening altercation. Though not in the manner he had intended, Jacob was able to get away. In a panic, he rode into the forest, got lost in the dark, and eventually reached the nearby property. Totally out of control. At daybreak, the farm's owners saw Jacob stumbling through the yard while muttering unintelligible words about black notebooks, names that had been erased, and a woman who used pen and paper to govern life and death. They brought Jacob to Union, but his statement sounded delusional because of how terrified and exhausted he was. As he heard the account, Sheriff Timothy Coleman became increasingly dubious. Deborah Kearns worked for one of the most well-known families in the area. Jacob was merely a blacksmith who had been traumatized and might have been experiencing nervous weariness. Upon checking, they discovered that the alleged notebook with the notes had vanished during the frantic forest retreat. Ashwood received a formal visit from Sheriff Coleman. Deborah gave him the immaculately arranged account books, greeted him with tea and biscuits, and unfortunately revealed that Jacob had been exhibiting symptoms of mental instability for months. She even stated that she had kept him on out of sympathy but had contemplated terminating him due to health concerns. The sheriff was so certain of Deborah's innocence and Jacob's insanity that he left the farm. After that night, Jacob Winters never entirely recovered. After being admitted to a Charleston mental health facility, he spent the ensuing years telling the same unbelievable story. According to historical medical documents, the man was unable to resume his regular life due to unreasonable visions and anxieties. Deborah had triumphed once more, this time by skillfully manipulating social perceptions and power dynamics rather than by using physical force. The Appalachian region saw substantial changes in the 1890s. By connecting once remote areas, railroads extended their lines. The traditional rural economy started to change as a result of industrialization. However, time seemed to have stopped at Ashwood. Deborah maintained her flawless routine and pleased the Harrisons with her efficiency in handling the house. They thought about her invaluable and frequently raised her pay without considering the actual cost of such commitment. The staff members who continued to work for Deborah adopted an odd way of surviving. They were taught to never ask questions, to never gripe, and to never be overly curious or independent. They avoided being noticed, stayed undetectable, and carried out their tasks in a robotic manner. Living individuals acted like shadows in this spectral world, terrified of their own nature. Margaret Foster became a new employee at Ashwood in 1892. After the family business went bankrupt, the 28-year-old Ohio native was in dire need of a job. Margaret was not like the other workers. She had a formal education, was fluent in reading and writing, and had held administrative jobs in the past. In what would turn out to be her first planned error in years, Deborah recruited her to assist with the property records and correspondence. By nature, Margaret was perceptive. The discrepancies in the accounting records, the gaps in the employee records, and the expenses that did not correspond with the household's actual spending were all readily apparent to her. Margaret, however, was wary, in contrast to Ellen Crawford. She didn't go straight up to Deborah. Rather, she started copying documents covertly and concealing them among her personal possessions. Margaret believed she was seeing something too significant to ignore, even if it was a risky and slow procedure. In 1893, during the severe winter, a snowstorm totally isolated almost 2 weeks of Ashwood, The land was isolated from the outside world and the roads became impassable. Margaret saw something that would alter everything during this time of forced seclusion. One morning, she heard odd noises emanating from the main house's basement. They were the sound of wood groaning under strain, heavy movement, and muffled voices. Margaret went down the stairs in silence, solitary in the darkness. She noticed Deborah using a flashlight to come out of the cellar, put on a mask of icy focus. Unaware of the observer, the housekeeper placed the key into an inside pocket of her dress, closed the basement door with a large padlock Margaret had never seen before, and returned upstairs to her rooms. Margaret remained awake the next few nights, watching for any movement. It was always in the darkest hours of the morning that the sounds from the cellar recurred erratically. Additionally, a strange odor was emanating from the floors, something in between moist dirt and something Margaret didn't want to name. She was aware that she had to enter that basement, but she was also aware that it might be fatal. Deborah's need to travel to Union to resolve banking issues on the Harrisons' behalf presented an opportunity. Given the state of the roads following the storm, the drive took the entire day. Margaret frantically looked for a duplicate of the basement key after waiting for Deborah to depart. She discreetly searched the storage chests, the kitchen cabinets, and the offices, but found nothing. Deborah had that key with her at all times. Margaret took a chance. The lock would be forced by her. She worked on the padlock for about an hour, sweating a lot in spite of the chilly weather, after finding tools in Jacob Winter's abandoned workshop. With a metallic snap that reverberated along the deserted hallway, the mechanism finally gave way. The hefty wooden door creaked open on old hinges as Margaret pushed it. Finished. The dim afternoon light that came in through the windows was engulfed by darkness. With a shaking candle in her hand, she carefully made her way down the stone steps. The cellar, which extended beneath the house's whole structure, was far larger than it should have been. The walls were made of rough stone and were coated in what appeared to be dark moss and moisture. There, the stench was more overpowering, nearly intolerable. Margaret pressed a handkerchief over her nose and pushed herself to go on. What she discovered in the basement might alter this. The full narrative. Notebooks, just like the one Jacob Winters had described, were stacked on shelves. With shaking hands, Margaret picked one up and turned to the first page. Names, dates, sums of money, and behavioral and attitude evaluations were all included in the thorough record. The markings next to certain names, however, were the most unsettling aspect. In black ink, a simple cross is created. In that first notepad, Margaret noted 17 crosses. One notepad after another she opened. They all had the same compulsive behavior. Deborah had meticulously recorded every employee who had worked for her throughout the years. Each cross that appeared on the pages stood for a person who had vanished into thin air. Margaret's legs grew weaker. She was in possession of proof of a horrific, unfathomable thing. However, there was more. Margaret noticed a patch of floor and ground at the far end of the basement, partially covered by a tarp that seemed as if it had just been disturbed. Tiny, asymmetrical mounds, if something had been buried, the earth would have been poorly concealed. She knew what those hills stood for without the need for tangible proof. The reality was as cold and transparent as crystal-clear water. Margaret hurried upstairs after grabbing 3 of the notebooks. She concealed the notebooks inside a mattress in her room by opening a seam on the side and sandwiching the thin volumes between the filling, after locking the basement once more as best she could. She could hardly manage the needle since her hands were shaking so violently. To reassemble the fabric by sewing it. Deborah discovered Margaret working peacefully in the living room, cataloging mail as if nothing had happened, when she returned from Union around dusk. With her sharp eyes, the housekeeper examined the maid, looking for any indication of abnormality. Margaret described the task she had finished that day with a solid voice, controlled gestures, and a neutral attitude. It was her life's act. Margaret Foster was aware that she had to move fast, but she also understood that she would die if she made one mistake. As an experienced predator, Deborah could detect mistrust and fear with terrifying accuracy. Margaret meticulously planned every detail of her escape over the next few days, maintaining her flawless routine. She couldn't just dash out the door the way Jacob had. She required a strategy that would ensure both her life and that the appropriate authorities would be notified of the evidence. The answer was unanticipated. The Harrison family declared in February 1894 that they would be. Arriving in Ashwood ahead of schedule to commemorate the couple's wedding anniversary. They would bring visitors from Charleston and other cities when they arrived in 10 days. Deborah would be totally preoccupied with the preparations because it would be a big social event. Margaret recognized her opportunity. She wrote a thorough letter to Richard Ashford, the prosecutor for Monroe County, who was known for being strict and uncompromising. Margaret detailed all she had discovered in the letter. The basement brought up the notebooks containing her macabre records and begged for a covert inquiry. The letter could not be sent by normal mail. All mail that left the property was under Faz Deborah's control. She required an alternative. A fabric supplier who frequently visited Ashwood provided the solution. Henry Doyle was an elderly traveling salesman who had consistently shown Margaret warmth and respect. During one of Henry's visits, she discreetly asked him to deliver the letter, went to the lawyer, and offered to pay for the favor with her savings. Henry consented without taking the money after noticing the young woman's desperation in her eyes. Margaret chose to include the most recent and unsettling entries from one of Deborah's tiny journals in the letter. In order to provide a temporary hiding spot that Henry could carry without drawing attention to himself, she sewn the notebook into a bundle of sewing thread. On a gloomy March afternoon, the merchant departed Ashwood, bringing with him the potential for justice that Margaret had put everything on the line to achieve. The days that followed were a torment of silence. While Deborah organized the arrangements for the Harrisons' arrival, Margaret carried on with her regular tasks. The entire facility was thoroughly cleaned. Despite the ongoing cold, gardens were maintained, and under the housekeeper's unrelenting supervision, servants worked frantically. Nobody dared to voice their displeasure over the overwhelming task. Everyone was aware of what would happen if Deborah wasn't pleased. Kearns. Margaret's letter was initially met with mistrust by Prosecutor Richard Ashford. It seemed unlikely that a well-respected governor would be the target of accusations, perhaps the result of a personal disagreement or an overactive imagination. However, his attitude shifted as he opened the notebook and started reading the careful entries. No rational person could have made up the story those pages told. The dates were too exact, the details too detailed. The names were those of persons he recognized by sight. Ashford accomplished something out of the ordinary. He chose to conduct a covert investigation before taking any action. He looked for individuals mentioned in that diary, spoke with families who had hired Deborah over the years, and checked county records. What he found was a frightening and recurring pattern. Deborah had overseen the disappearance of at least 23 people, all of whom had left behind convenient but unsubstantiated reasons. Additionally, the prosecutor discovered something intriguing in the bank. Documents. For someone in her position, Deborah Kearns had significant savings, recurring payments that were higher than her known pay. Upon investigating the source of some of this money, Ashford found that some sums precisely matched the last salaries of unaccounted-for workers. She was collecting payments from deceased individuals, falsifying their signatures on the receipts, and keeping the difference for herself. She was incredibly intelligent. In addition to eliminating individuals who posed a threat to her authority, Deborah made money off of their disappearances as well. The account book revealed a complex web of financial fraud she had perpetuated for decades, including payments to phantom employees and inflated charges for products that were never purchased. Unaware that their dependable maid was a covert criminal, the Harrison family was being routinely robbed. Richard Ashford built his argument with great care. He had to be careful not to make a mistake. Deborah was trusted by influential families, had social ties, and it would take years to establish that reputation. Margaret Foster would fail and possibly be in danger if she made a hasty decision. In order to obtain indisputable proof, the prosecutor had to enter the Ashwood basement. He planned his move to take place during the Harrisons' visit. Deborah would find it more difficult to tamper with or erase evidence if credible witnesses were present. Richard Ashford, 2 deputies, and a local judge arrived at Ashwood on March 23, 1894. They had a search warrant on them, based on Margaret Foster's testimony and preliminary evidence. Deborah greeted the party with her typical poise, but when she noticed Margaret standing next to the prosecutor, her expression changed. The moment the mask peeled away, exposing something icy and cunning behind, was only a flash. She knew at a way what had happened, who had deceived her, and how her terrifying dominion was about to fall apart. As the prosecutor described the visit's goal, the Harrison family looked on in disbelief. At first, they objected, fiercely standing up for Deborah. Ashford stood his ground, showed the notebook Margaret had sent, and asked to enter the property's basement despite the fact that it was impossible, ridiculous, and undoubtedly a horrible misunderstanding. Deborah attempted to object, saying that the area was off limits because of structural issues, but the warrant was unambiguous and unquestionable. Everyone knew there was a serious problem as soon as they unlocked the basement door and went down those stone steps. There was no denying the atmosphere and the stench. Repressive. Deborah's fixation was shown by the macabre library of identical notebooks on the shelves. As the deputies investigated the remainder of the subterranean area, the prosecutor started looking through the volumes. One of the deputies found the spot where the earth appeared to be disturbed, deep in the basement. After he summoned the others, they started using makeshift equipment to dig cautiously. They didn't have to delve very far. The initial finding was made at a depth of less than half a meter, and what they discovered validated everyone's worst fears. There were secrets in Ashwood's basement that shouldn't have been kept there. Mrs. Harrison passed out. It was time for the judge to get outside. Deborah Kearns watched in complete silence as everything she had built was destroyed, while the deputies carried on with their grim work. Her eyes revealed a cold intelligence that was calculating possibilities and looking for solutions that no longer existed, but her face was a mask of expressionlessness. Deborah Kearns was ordered by Richard Ashford. Arrest right away. While work in the basement proceeded under close supervision, she was escorted off the property by deputies. After being led to a secure area, Margaret Foster testified fully about all she had seen and learned. In addition to saving her own life, her bravery in speaking the truth may have saved the lives of other potential employees who might have been caught in that woman's web. The news went viral throughout Monroe County. Sensational headlines appeared in local newspapers, and reporters arrived to cover the case from bigger cities. Fascinating and horrifying in equal measure is the tale of the housekeeper who had operated with impunity for almost 20 years. How could anyone have maintained such a secret for so long? How come so many people had vanished without thorough investigations? The responses to these queries exposed structural defects in the era's society. The upper classes frequently ignored domestic workers and saw them as interchangeable and easily replaceable. Sections. Few genuinely cared or inquired when someone vanished. Deborah, who knew precisely which victims to pick, had used this societal apathy to her devilish advantage. Individuals without close relatives, powerful contacts, or someone who would pose challenging questions. The notebooks that Deborah kept became essential components of the inquiry. Over the course of 18 years, there were a total of 37 of them. Obsessively detailed records about the staff members she oversaw were included in each volume. She took note of everything: temperament, routines, interpersonal connections, vulnerabilities, and obedience levels. Humans were viewed as specimens to be cataloged and controlled in this perverted anthropological study. Forensic analysis was done on the crosses next to some names. The prosecutor was able to identify 29 people who had been marked in this manner. Only 3 of these were still alive and could be found elsewhere. They attested to the fact that they had left Ashwood after becoming aware of the threat, abandoning their possessions and unclaimed salaries. The evidence discovered in the basement strongly indicated that the remaining 26 would never be discovered alive. In September 1894, Deborah Kearns' trial got underway at the Monroe County Courthouse. In recent West Virginia history, it was one of the most anticipated cases. Witnesses, reporters, and the victims' relatives, who at last hoped for answers, filled the courtroom. Deborah walked into the courtroom with the same straight back and icy demeanor that had always defined her. She displayed no fear, no regret, no identifiable feeling. The case put forth by the prosecution was disastrous. As the notebooks were presented one by one, Prosecutor Ashford read a few chosen passages that illustrated Deborah's cunning. Margaret Foster described the stifling atmosphere and ominous records in her testimony regarding her discoveries in the basement. Financial experts showed how Deborah had used complex frauds to embezzle thousands of dollars over the years. However, the most powerful testimony originated with Jacob Winters. For the trial, he was transported from the Charleston institution. Due to years of treatment and the trauma that had never gone away, Jacob was older and more fragile. His voice wavered as he took the witness stand, but his words were understandable. He talked about the terrifying atmosphere in Ashwood, the mysterious disappearances, and his fruitless attempts to notify the authorities. Deborah's defense team made an effort to claim that the disappearances were coincidences, that farm laborers often had abrupt job changes, and that the notebook entries were just standard administrative notes. With an almost impossible case, her attorney, Arthur Peaton, did his best. He attempted to undermine Jacob's testimony by claiming mental instability, questioned how the evidence should be interpreted, and speculated that Margaret Foster may have had personal reasons for implicating her employer. That didn't work at all. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before coming back with a unanimous guilty decision. Deborah Kearns was found guilty on several counts, including conspiracy, financial fraud, and murder. Horatio Blackwood, a well-known veteran who served as the presiding judge, delivered the sentence in a somber and solemn tone. Physical evidence discovered in the basement would unquestionably prove that Deborah was responsible for the deaths of at least 8 victims, for which she would be hanged. December 1894 was the planned date of the execution. In the months preceding her demise, Deborah stayed behind bars in the county, consistently refusing to discuss her offenses. Reporters attempted to speak with her. Psychologists were interested in her. Religious leaders provided consolation on a spiritual level. She turned them all down. She remained virtually silent, simply answering questions that were necessary for her everyday survival. Investigators were extremely irritated by this silence. So many questions remained unanswered. For what reason had she begun? Beyond money, what drove her? In reality, how many victims were there? Were there any other? Establishments where she had worked prior to coming to West Virginia. Deborah would carry the secrets of her pre-1876 past with her into the afterlife. A few weeks prior to Deborah's execution, Margaret Foster made an attempt to see her in prison. She needed to comprehend the woman who had nearly ruined her, and she had her own questions. The rendezvous was permitted by the guards, and Margaret was led to the cell where Deborah waited for her destiny. Iron bars kept the two women apart as they stood face to face for a while. At that moment, neither said anything. Margaret broke the silence by asking simply, "Why? Why so much suffering? Why this obsessive control? Why the need to document everything so meticulously?" Deborah looked at her with those unexpected, cold eyes and spoke more than a few words for the first time since her imprisonment. Her answer was disturbing in its simplicity. She had learned that she could control destinies, and this power had become addictive. There was no regret or madness in her words. Margaret left that cell feeling more disturbed than before. She had hoped to find some explanation that made sense, some past trauma or mental health issues. The notebooks were not merely administrative records. They were trophies. Each name, each note, each drawn cross represented her ability to decide who lived and who disappeared. It was a form of control that transcended any financial motivation. Deborah Kearns. Kearns' final days in prison were characterized by a monotonous routine. She would wake up early, receive her simple meals, and spend hours sitting in complete silence staring at the stone wall of her cell. Guards report that she never cried, never showed anxiety or fear in the face of imminent death, and instead she found only deliberate choice. Deborah Kearns had consciously chosen the path of terror without any external compulsion beyond her own desire for domination. In the meantime, the surrounding community struggled to comprehend the enormity of what had happened, with families who had worked with Deborah over the years feeling betrayed and horrified. The Harrisons in particular faced not only financial consequences but also emotional trauma, as Deborah's frauds had cost the family thousands of dollars, and the Ashwood estate was left with a dark reputation that would never be erased. The local church held special masses in honor of the victims who had been identified. Reverend Samuel Pierce, who had attempted to inquire about the disappearances years prior, led the services with a noticeable burden on his shoulders, blaming himself for not pressing harder and for accepting Deborah's flimsy explanations when his pastoral instincts told him something was amiss. Margaret Foster became a complicated figure in the eyes of the community. Eventually, Margaret left the area, moving to Pittsburgh, where she attempted to rebuild her life far from the memories of Ashwood. Jacob Winters also left West Virginia after the trial, his vindication not bringing him the peace he had hoped for. Some viewed her as a heroine, the brave woman who finally exposed a criminal who had been operating in the shadows for decades. Others, however, kept an uncomfortable distance, as if she were tainted by her association with the terrible events. He died in 1902, with memories no man should bear. The day of Deborah's execution arrived on a chilly December morning. Light snow fell over Union, covering the town with a white blanket that contrasted eerily with the somber nature of the event. His psychological scars remained deep, and he never managed to return to regular work. He spent his final years living modestly with distant relatives in upstate New York, rarely speaking about the events that had shattered his sanity. Judge Blackwood, Prosecutor Ashford, and representatives of the victims' families were among the official witnesses called to the scene, which had been set up in the prison yard in accordance with the legal procedures of the time. Deborah was led into the courtyard at 6 a.m, walking upright as usual, wearing a plain gray prison-provided dress, her gray hair pulled back in a stiff bun, and her face maintaining the neutral expression that had become her signature. When the chaplain gave closing remarks, the executioner, a man named William Crawford, who had been doing this job for more than 10 years, prepared everything with professional efficiency, and Deborah climbed the steps of the gallows without hesitation, her steps firm despite the chains on her ankles. For spiritual comfort, she simply shook her head in silent refusal. When asked if she had any final words, she looked at the small group of witnesses and said, "There were others before me, and there will be others after." Deborah didn't elaborate, but she knew exactly what she meant when she said that. Was it a confession of more unidentified victims, a suggestion that there were unidentified accomplices, or just a philosophical commentary on human nature and the eternal existence of evil? Her final words were followed by the placing of the black hood over her head, and the execution, which occurred at 6:15 a.m., was swift and, according to official records, straightforward. Deborah Kearns died in that cold winter moment, but the questions she left behind would plague West Virginia for decades. Her body was interred in a remote part of the county cemetery in an unmarked grave, just a plain stone bearing her name and the dates of her birth and death. In the months after her execution, investigators tried to piece together Deborah's history prior to her arrival in the area in 1876, and they found some pieces. She had been born somewhere in Pennsylvania around 1814, married young to a man whose name was never conclusively proven, and she was widowed under circumstances that the records did not explain. There was a gap of about 10 years between her husband's alleged death and her appearance in West Virginia. Some researchers have suggested connections to unsolved disappearances in other states during that lost decade, but nothing has been proven. Was it possible that Deborah had practiced her evil techniques elsewhere before perfecting them in Ashwood? It was possible, but the Ashwood estate never fully recovered, and the Harrison family attempted to continue using the mansion, but the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. Servants refused to work there, and those who did rarely stayed more than a few months. Rumors circulated about the haunted basement, and even though the area had been thoroughly cleaned and partially renovated, what we know for sure is that she built an empire of terror over the course of 18 documented years that cost at least 26 confirmed lives. Sealed off, no one could forget what had been discovered there. The Harrisons eventually sold the property in 1898 for a small portion of its original value, and the new owners tried to turn it into a boarding house, but the endeavor soon failed. Over the ensuing decades, Ashwood passed through several hands, each struggling with the dark reputation that permanently tarnished those lands. Eventually, the mansion fell into disrepair, its Victorian towers slowly crumbling as nature reclaimed the land. Deborah. Researchers who have access to Kearns' notebooks describe an unsettling experience. Reading those pages is to witness the mind of someone who saw people as objects to be managed, controlled, and discarded as needed. There is no humanity in those meticulous notes, only cold calculations about utility and risk. One particularly unsettling aspect of the notebooks is the notes on behavior and loyalty. Kearns' notebooks were preserved as legal evidence and eventually transferred to the county's historical archives. It was a sophisticated control system that foreshadowed by decades techniques that psychologists would only begin to formally study in the 20th century. Deborah created detailed psychological profiles of each employee, identifying their weaknesses, fears, and pressure points. She knew exactly how to manipulate each person under her command, extracting maximum obedience through a combination of minimal rewards and implicit threats. The years following Deborah's execution brought about a profound reassessment of how. Social reformers used Ashwood's story as an example in campaigns for better working conditions and legal protections for domestic workers. The movement was slow, but Deborah Kearns' name became synonymous with the perils of widespread exploitation. Newspapers in various cities published investigative series on similar cases of employees disappearing under suspicious circumstances. However, the case revealed systemic vulnerabilities that allowed abuse to thrive undetected. The Karna case forced society to examine these issues that had previously been conveniently ignored. Prosecutor Richard Ashford became a respected figure in legal circles for his careful handling of the case. No other case reached the scale or meticulous documentation of Deborah's, and disturbing patterns were uncovered. People in positions of domestic authority occasionally abused their power in ways ranging from financial exploitation to more sinister forms of control. Margaret Foster eventually wrote a detailed account of her experiences in Ashwood, which circulated among publishers in New York and Philadelphia. Ashford acknowledged in later interviews that the case haunted him, not because of the legal difficulty, but because of the broader implications about how many other criminals might be operating with impunity under respectable facades. Ashford continued to apply the same rigor and attention to detail that had secured Deborah's conviction for another 15 years. However, it was never published during her lifetime because publishers deemed the content too strong for the general public of the time, particularly for female readers who made up a significant portion of the book market. Margaret's manuscript, which was rediscovered in the 1930s and gave historians a close-up view of the events, describes not only the horrors she discovered, but also the psychology of living under someone like Deborah's control. The surviving passages show a gifted writer and a perceptive observer of human nature. Jacob Winters left behind his own records, albeit fragmented. During his years at the Charleston Institution, he occasionally wrote in diaries provided by doctors. It is a valuable document about power dynamics and institutional abuse, relevant far beyond the specific case of Ashwood. These diaries, which were part of his treatment, alternated between crystal-clear lucidity and obvious confusion. But in the clear moments, Jacob expressed profound insights into Deborah's manipulation of those around her, describing how she used silence and glances to control behavior, and how she created an atmosphere of fear without ever making explicit threats. One of Jacob's most unsettling observations was about Deborah's victim selection, noting that she never chose people with close relationships or attentive families. Her victims were always people the world wouldn't notice right away, such as orphans, widows without close relatives, recent immigrants without established social networks, and people who had severed ties with their communities of origin. It was a deliberate selection based on social invisibility and vulnerability. The Harrison family suffered long-term repercussions as a result of their association with Deborah. Despite the fact that they were just as much a victim of her as the missing employees, some in the neighborhood blamed them for carelessness. How had they overlooked what was taking place beneath their own roof? Why had they never questioned Deborah's easy-to-follow justifications for workers quitting without warning? These questions particularly troubled Mr. Harrison, who experienced health issues linked to stress and guilt. Mrs. Harrison became withdrawn following the events, seldom leaving her Charleston home. She had fully trusted Deborah, viewing her as both a friend and a servant, and the betrayal of that trust left deep wounds. Reverend Samuel Pierce devoted the final years of his ministry to social reforms aimed at protecting vulnerable workers. He frequently preached about community responsibility and the significance of paying attention to those on the margins of society. His most well-known sermon, delivered in 1896, used the Ashwood case. She expresses overwhelming guilt in preserved letters of correspondence with a distant cousin, and repeatedly questions how she failed to notice the signs that in retrospect seemed so obvious. In the years immediately following 1894, there was a noticeable rise in reports of abusive working conditions on rural properties in West Virginia. Workers who had previously remained silent out of fear or resignation now found the courage to speak out. Not all reports revealed situations as extreme as Ashwood's, but many exposed exploitation, as the sermon's text was published in religious newspapers and influenced other clergymen throughout the region. Deborah's notebooks provided a unique window into the mentality of someone capable of systematic violence without apparent remorse or obvious mental instability. The Kearns case had opened a floodgate of social conscience, and academics interested in criminology and psychology began to take notice. Prior to the modern era of forensic studies, it was uncommon to have such detailed documentation of a female criminal's mind. In 1902, a psychologist named Dr. Edmund Hartley visited the Monroe County Archives to examine Deborah's notebooks. He published an academic paper analyzing what he called an organized predatory personality, arguing that Deborah represented a type of criminal different from the impulsive or passionate cases that dominated court records. She planned, documented, and carried out her actions with an almost scientific methodology. The question of the actual number of victims has never been definitively answered, although physical records confirmed 26 disappearances with strong evidence of foul play. However, there were gaps in the notebooks, periods where pages appeared to have been removed, or where the numbering of entries suggested deliberate omissions. Some researchers estimate that the real number could be significantly higher. Hartley's paper anticipated concepts that would only become mainstream in criminology decades later. Deborah may have killed more than 40 people during her criminal career. There was also the issue of the 10 years before she arrived in West Virginia in 1876. Investigators attempted to track her movements during that time, but the trails consistently went cold. Some conjectured that she may have operated under different names in other areas, honing her techniques before relocating permanently to the Appalachian. These theories are still unproven, but the possibility haunts those familiar with the case. The Ashwood estate became an object of morbid fascination in the decades that followed. Locals avoided the area, creating a zone of silence around the cursed lands. No one wanted to be associated with that address. The mere mention of Ashwood in social conversation caused visible discomfort. In 1907, a fire of unknown origin destroyed much of the mansion's structure. Some suspected deliberate arson, and the cellar survived the fire because of its sturdy stone construction, and it remained for years after the fire. Others thought the fire was accidentally started by vagrants using the abandoned property as temporary shelter. Regardless of the cause, the upper floors were destroyed by the flames, leaving only the stone walls of the ground floor and the basement intact, like a charred skeleton, reminding us of what had once been there. Accessible through the debris, hand-reported tales of courageous or reckless individuals who ventured down into that shadowy area described suffocating feelings, a dense air that made their hair stand on end, and whether these were merely psychological conjectures based on knowledge of what had transpired there, or whether there was something truly unsettling about the physical layout of that location, depended on the storyteller. In the meantime, Monroe County continued to function. New families moved in, and old tales were slowly. The name Deborah Kearns was whispered as a warning, a reminder that evil could exist beneath masks of respectability and efficiency. Mothers cautioned their daughters seeking domestic employment to be cautious, to watch for signs of excessive control or oppressive atmospheres. The notebooks preserved in the county archives became the subject of periodic study. Local historians occasionally examined those pages, but those who lived through the events of 1894 could never fully forget. In 1915, an investigative journalist named Thomas Brennan decided to write a book about the case. He spent months interviewing survivors, consulting archives, and gathering information about everyday life at the time. Despite their macabre nature, Deborah's records contained important details about household economics, hiring practices, cost of living, and social dynamics of rural West Virginia in the late 19th century. It was bloodstained knowledge, but knowledge nonetheless. Brennan treated the material with respect for the victims while omitting any information about Deborah's methodology, and the result was a book that was published in 1917 and sold fairly well in the area. Brennan's book raised awareness of the case again, but it also generated controversy, with some arguing that reliving those events caused needless suffering to the victims and survivors' families, and others defending it. The debate, which reflected larger tensions in American society about how to deal with historical violence and trauma, focused on the importance of remembering and documenting, arguing that forgetting would allow similar atrocities to be repeated. Margaret Foster, who was then living in Pittsburgh under her married name, read Brennan's book and wrote to the author, praising his sensitivity in addressing the subject while also correcting some inaccurate details, which Brennan incorporated in later. In the 1920s, criminologists and psychologists started using the Kearns case in academic studies of criminal behavior, and Deborah's meticulous notebooks provided rare data on the mindset of a serial criminal before such a category was formally recognized by forensic science. The preface included specific thanks to Margaret, and it was one of the last times Margaret publicly engaged with the affair that had defined her youth. Researchers debated whether she should be classified as a sociopath, A. The ability of Deborah to maintain perfect social facades for extended periods of time, interacting normally with landlords, merchants, and local authorities without raising suspicion, occasionally participating in community events, contributing to charities, and maintaining the appearance of a respectable citizen was one aspect that fascinated researchers. Deborah could be described as a psychopath, or simply as someone with extreme moral deviations operating within superficial social norms. The last direct survivors of the event started to pass away in the 1920s and 1930s. Reverend Samuel Pierce died in 1919 during the influenza epidemic that ravaged the nation. Lawyer Richard Ashford died in 1924 from heart complications at the age of 72. And Margaret Foster passed away in 1931 after leading a relatively quiet life after leaving West Virginia. Intelligence and exceptional emotional control were traits of a calculating operator, rather than someone dominated by uncontrollable impulses. In 1935, the county ordered the Ashwood estate, which was already in ruins, to be completely demolished. The stones were removed, the land was leveled, and the area left vacant. Trees were planted where the mansion once stood in an effort to allow nature to take over. With their deaths, the living memory of the events began to fade, replaced by written records and local legends. The Great Depression brought new challenges that dominated attention, and the Kearns case gradually receded into the collective consciousness. The story endures in historical archives, yellowed newspapers, and preserved accounts, a sobering reminder that monsters don't always look like we expect them to. Sometimes they dress respectably, speak politely, and operate within social structures that should protect the weak. Today, few people know the exact location where Ashwood once stood. Monroe County changed during the 20th century, and new landmarks replaced the old ones. The simple stone that bore Deborah Kearns' name eventually deteriorated over time and weather, and sometime in the 1940s it fell over and became partially covered by vegetation. No one bothered to restore it, as if the community as a whole wished that even the physical reminder of her existence would vanish from the earth. Deborah Kearns' grave in the county cemetery was left unvisited for decades. The years of World War II brought a pause to scholarly discussions about historical crimes like the Kearns case. Following the end of the war, as societies started to comprehend humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty, the case of Deborah Kearns gained new contextual relevance. Post-war researchers who wanted to understand how ordinary people could commit extraordinary acts of evil found a valuable case study in Deborah's case. At the time, the country was preoccupied with external threats, and the domestic horrors of the past seemed insignificant in comparison to the atrocities emerging from the European battlefields. Notebooks. She was not a clearly disturbed or socially marginalized person. She was intelligent, articulate, and able to handle social complexities with ease. Her ability to compartmentalize her actions while preserving an appearance of normalcy echoed patterns seen in other dark historical contexts. In the 1950s, there was an attempt to make a movie based on the case. After reading Thomas Brennan's book, a Hollywood screenwriter named Philip Donovan became enthralled with the story and traveled to West Virginia, spoke with the descendants of the families involved, and looked through historical archives. The ambitious screenplay he wrote sought to depict not only the events, but also the social context that gave Deborah the freedom to act without consequence. The film project encountered immediate opposition, with the victims' descendants protesting against the commercial exploitation of family tragedies and community organizations in West Virginia, claiming that the movie would unjustly damage the state's reputation. Although most female criminals of the 1960s were framed within specific categories related to crimes of passion, Deborah Kearns became a subject of study because she challenged prevailing stereotypes about crime and gender. Hollywood studios hesitated in the face of the dark nature of the material and the potential controversies, and eventually the project was abandoned, and Donovan's script remained unproduced, filed away in some studio vault. A sociologist named Dr. Patricia Henshaw published a thorough analysis of the case in 1967, exploring how 19th-century gender and class structures created opportunities for certain types of crime. Governors like Deborah occupied unique positions, having authority over lower-class employees but dependence on higher-class employers. Deborah did not fit into these molds, and her actions were planned, calculated, and carried out with a coldness that defied conventional explanations. The 1970s saw a resurgence of interest in true crime as a literary and journalistic genre. Writers started revisiting historical cases with new perspectives, and the Kearns case appeared in several anthologies. Each author brought different angles, some focusing on the psychological aspect, others on systemic failures, and still others on the stories of victims and survivors. Hanau claimed that this intermediate position created complex power dynamics that dishonest people could exploit devastatingly. In order to ensure that the historical evidence would be preserved for future generations, archivists in Monroe County worked to properly preserve the case's records during this time. Deborah's notebooks, which were deteriorating and now almost a century old, were meticulously restored and digitized. The digitization project included not only the notebooks but also trial transcripts, correspondence, and newspaper articles from the time. In 1982, a room at the State Historical Museum in Charleston was devoted to the Kearns case. The exhibit was somber but instructive, placing the events within the social and economic realities of 19th-century West Virginia. It featured photographs of the Ashwood estate prior to its destruction, personal belongings of the identified victims, and replicas of the notebooks with selected pages. The curation struck a balance between historical honesty about what had happened and respect for the victims. Regarding the way museums should depict violent histories, some visitors found the information to be appropriately somber and educational, while others felt uncomfortable, wondering if it was moral to display artifacts associated with so much suffering. Teachers discussed whether or not students should attend the exhibition and at what age it would be appropriate, reflecting larger concerns about trauma, memory, and historical responsibility. In the 1990s, as the Internet gained popularity, information regarding the Kearns case became more widely available. Amateur genealogists started tracking down family ties with survivors and victims. Some found distant relatives among those who vanished, while others found ancestors who had worked on Deborah's properties but survived. These discoveries individualized the story, turning names and files into actual people with descendants living today. In 1996, a retired teacher named Elelanina Mitchell began a particularly poignant project in which she committed herself to identifying and honoring each known victim of the Karna case. Eleanor compiled biographies of the people whose lives were cut short by Deborah by researching church records, cemeteries, and family archives. Her work humanized the victims, portraying them as people with stories, dreams, and connections rather than as statistics. The book that emerged from Elelanina's project, published in 1999 under the title Silenced Voices, The Victims of Ashwood, became a crucial resource, with each chapter devoted to an identified victim, reconstructing. At the beginning of the new millennium, the Karnas case had established itself as one of the most studied historical crimes in the Appalachian region. Universities included the case in courses on criminology, social history, and gender studies. Documentary filmmakers considered creating pieces on the subject. It was a memorial in book form, ensuring that those people were remembered for more than just being victims of a notorious criminal. Subject. In 2003, Monroe County erected a discrete memorial near the site where Ashwood once stood. It was a simple bronze plaque mounted on local stone that listed the names of known victims and included an inscription in memory of those whose lives were lost and those whose courage brought truth to light. The dedication ceremony was small but significant. Despite the sensitivity of the material remaining a significant obstacle, the story had stood the test of time, remaining relevant more than a century after the events. In the decades after Deborah's execution, the memorial remained a distinct reminder of historical tragedy in a landscape that had moved on. The memorial was attended by descendants, historians, and county officials. Some argued that it permanently marked a place that should be allowed to be forgotten, while others defended the importance of publicly acknowledging the suffering and making sure the victims were remembered. Brought about significant changes to the Appalachian region. Industrialization changed rural communities. New generations were born with no direct memory of the terrible events, and life continued on its inevitable path. However, there was something about that story that persisted, like mist in the mountains even after the sun had risen, even after the land had been leveled and demolished. The Ashwood estate maintained an odd reputation. Farmers who tried to cultivate the land reported unexplainable problems, such as crops that didn't flourish as they should, animals that avoided certain areas, and a general unease that made workers prefer to keep their distance. Were these just superstitions fueled by knowledge of the past? Probably, but the stories continued in local taverns and conversations around campfires, and Deborah's notebooks remained in the county archives, objects of morbid curiosity for those brave enough to leaf through them. Every page revealed a mind that operated on a different frequency than most people, where empathy and remorse simply did not exist as operational concepts. Margaret Foster lived to a very old age, but those who knew her in her later years say that she never spoke much about Ashwood. There was a profound sadness in her eyes when the subject came up, an invisible weight she carried even decades later. There was something unsettling about that meticulous handwriting, the cold, calculated notes about human lives treated like inventory items. Jacob Winters spent his last years in a state of melancholic tranquility. The panic attacks subsided over time, but he never fully recovered the person he had been before that night of desperate escape through the woods. In moments of lucidity, he spoke of how some people possess such a profound inner darkness that it contaminates everything around them. Some memoirs were fragmented, but he never managed to complete a comprehensive account. Jacob claimed that he saw madness in Deborah, but that he saw something colder and more calculated than madness could explain. In his final sermons, Reverend Samuel Pierce reflected on moral responsibility and the perils of complicit silence, blaming himself for not pressing harder, when his instincts told him that something was seriously amiss in Ashwood. Witnesses claimed that he whispered on his deathbed how many times he had seen signs but had chosen the ease of believing easy. Explanations. Many people in the community expressed this regret in silence. The Harrison family never fully recovered from the betrayal. They were deeply scarred to learn that someone they had completely trusted had committed such crimes under their roof. They sold all of their property in the area and relocated to a different part of the country, hoping to start over far away from the tainted memories. But even from a distance, they were plagued by questions about how they had missed it, how they had failed to protect those ostensibly responsible for them. Prosecutor Richard Ashford resumed his work with renewed vigor, transformed by the Karna case, who became more perceptive of subtle patterns and more willing to look into cases when something didn't seem right, even in the absence of clear evidence. In the years that followed, he prosecuted a number of other cases of abuse and exploitation, always keeping in mind that monsters rarely made their nature known in public. His legacy was a more cautious and compassionate approach to justice in Monroe County. The story of Deborah Kearns has evolved over time into a hybrid of historical fact and local legend, with each generation adding its own layers of interpretation and lessons learned from those terrible events. For some, it served as a warning against blindly believing appearances. For others, it served as a reminder that the bravery to bear witness to dangerous truths can save lives. And for still others, it was just a terrifying tale told on dark nights. The cemetery where Deborah was buried eventually fell into partial disuse. As new cemeteries were built nearer to the growing city, the old burial ground was forgotten and only occasionally visited by curious bystanders and local historians. Deborah's stone, which had been simple from the beginning, deteriorated until it was nearly inedible, and the area was covered in wild vegetation as if nature were attempting to conceal that mark in the ground. At dusk, in particular, when shadows stretched between the old trees, the cemetery gained awe. The place had a particularly depressing atmosphere, and occasional visitors reported feeling a deep sadness there, an emotional weight that seemed to permeate the very air. Was this just psychological suggestion? A collective memory of suffering manifesting as a feeling? Probably, but the sensation was real enough for those who experienced it. The victims' descendants carried their own burdens through the generations, and some families spoke candidly about their ancestors lost in Ashwood, keeping their memories alive through. There was no right or wrong way to deal with such a legacy. Each family found its own way through generational grief. The question that always lingered, whispered in discussions about the case, was why Deborah had chosen that path. What drove her beyond financial gain, which by itself did not explain the scale or the methodology. The notebooks. There may never be a satisfactory answer to the question of how far she could push her power over other people, as some minds work according to logics that defy normal understanding. Deborah Kearns seemed to be one of those people, whose lack of empathy and emotional coldness allowed her to treat people like objects without any internal motivation. Her obsession with control and documentation went beyond simple criminal practicality. Ashwood's legacy eventually went beyond the specifics of the case and became a broader symbol of worker vulnerability, of how power structures can be abused, and of the importance of believing those who testify against established authority. Margaret Foster risked everything because she believed that truth mattered more than personal safety. She did not exhibit moral dissonance. She was not tormented by her actions, and she simply carried out her plans with mechanical efficiency. Jacob Winters attempted to warn. The mist still covers the Appalachian Mountains on chilly mornings, just as it did in 1894 when Deborah Kearns' sentence was carried out. The forest still murmurs with wind through ancient trees, guarding secrets in their deep shadows. time flows inexorably, erasing some memories while preserving others in strange and persistent forms. The land where Ashwood once stood is no bare, covered in grass and young trees. Their bravery, though costly, ultimately brought justice. It is a trick of light and imagination. Of course, the mansion is long gone, its stones scattered, its structure reduced to dust and memory, but sometimes, according to some locals, sunlight is able to filter through the trees in that specific spot, creating strange patterns on the ground, making it almost impossible to imagine the mansion still there, somber and imposing as a silent witness to its own terrible past. Each name in the notebooks represented an interrupted story, a potential never realized. Deborah Kearns was buried in a grave without visitors, without flowers, without any mark of remembrance or mourning. She existed, caused untold suffering, and ceased to exist. The victims she destroyed deserve to be remembered, not for their way of dying, but for the lives they led before coming into contact with her. Thomas Whitfield, with his dreams of a better future, Ellen Crawford, with her courage to question injustice, and Deborah Kearns remains. Foster and Jacob Winters, on the other hand, stand for something different but no less significant. They demonstrate that human bravery can triumph even in the most dire circumstances, when terror seems unavoidable and escape is impossible. They suffered terrible consequences for their choices, leaving them with lifelong scars, but their actions saved countless others who would have fallen into Deborah's clutches if she had carried on with her operations. Ashwood's story offers no simple solace or satisfying conclusions. A story about humanity's capacity for deliberate cruelty and how societies can fail to protect their most vulnerable members. But it's also about resistance, about truth eventually coming to light, even when it's buried deep, and about justice arriving, albeit slowly. In the last years of the 19th and early 20th centuries, gradual changes started to offer more protections for domestic workers, not because of sudden generosity from the upper classes, but because cases like Ashwood forced recognition that unsupervised. The exact location where Deborah Kearns' sentence was carried out is now just another piece of land in the West Virginia landscape. There is no memorial, no plaque marking the spot, and no physical indication that justice was finally served there on a cold December morning after years of silent terror. Perhaps that's fitting. Some places don't need markers. Vulnerability created opportunities for devastating exploitation. The reforms were imperfect and slow, but they represented movement toward a more humane environment. The earth endures, absorbing human stories into its geological layers, guarding secrets that occasionally emerge when someone decides to dig deep enough. The mountains continue their eternal cycle, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding on their slopes. Snow falls in winter, covering everything in pure white. Spring brings flowers and renewal. Summer warms the valleys, and autumn paints the forests in fiery hues. Perhaps that's why some stories endure in the collective memory without the need for stone or bronze to anchor them. What we should learn from this dark Appalachian tale is that vigilance is important. Questioning authority is sometimes necessary, even if it's risky. Believing vulnerable witnesses can mean the difference between justice and more suffering. Appearances are deceiving, and social respectability is not a guarantee of morality. Courage sometimes means risking everything for the truth, even when no one else seems to care. Deborah Kearns lived 62 years in this world, and for nearly 20 of those years she wielded. Deborah's notebooks remained a silent testament to her calculating nature, each meticulous entry, each cross drawn. Her story should not be forgotten, not out of morbid fascination with evil, but as a constant reminder of the consequences when societies fail to protect those on the margins, when authority is not questioned, and when silence is chosen over hard truth. Deborah had absolute power over vulnerable people, destroying lives with a methodical coldness that still intrigues more than a century later. What was particularly disturbing about Deborah was not just what she did, but how she did it. She followed social norms, kept up a perfect appearance of respectability, and carried out her professional duties. Each record of behavior and obedience, when paired with a name, showed a mind that saw people as pieces on a personal chessboard. There was no passion in her actions, no anger or uncontrollable emotion, only cold calculation and methodical execution of elaborate plans, hatched during solitary nights in silent rooms. With an efficiency that impressed employers, Margaret Foster was a perfect predator, hiding in plain sight, shielded by both her own skill and social expectations about how women in her position should behave. Eventually, she married and established a quiet life in Pittsburgh, but those who knew her well reported that she never slept soundly, experiencing occasional nightmares, moments of sudden tension when she saw someone who vaguely resembled Deborah, and a constant vigilance that never fully left her. Jacob Winters left behind fragmented writings that showed a mind desperately trying to process what he had witnessed, explaining that true terror was not a sudden encounter with violence, but rather the gradual realization that someone close to him was capable of atrocities while maintaining a mask of normalcy. Her courage was paid not only in those terrifying days in Ashwood, but in all the restless nights that followed for the rest of her life. It was learning that the person who served his dinner who talked about the weather. Reverend Pierce spent his last years preaching about the significance of true community watchdogs, not the superficial watchdogs of gossip and petty judgments, but genuine attention to the well-being of the most vulnerable in society. He maintained that communities had a moral obligation to question when convenient explanations were offered for disappearances, to look into when. In private letters, Mrs. Harrison expressed her distress over each time she had accepted Deborah's explanations without question, and to believe when marginalized voices tried to warn of dangers. The Harrison family carried guilt for the rest of their lives, not legal guilt because they were just as much victims as the missing employees, but moral guilt because they had failed to see what was happening under their responsibility. A tireless advocate for reforms in the domestic work system, attorney Richard Ashford pushed for legislation requiring stricter employee registration, more robust investigation processes when disappearances were reported, and legal protections that would empower workers to report abuse without fear of retaliation. His initiatives faced resistance from sectors that benefited from the status quo, but eventually some. Changes were put into place. In the decades following the events, when the last direct witnesses had passed away and the story had become more legend than living memory, academics started to look at the Karna case from a new perspective, analyzing not only the crimes, but also what they revealed about the social structures of the time. They asked why employee testimonies were so readily disregarded while Deborah's statements were taken at face value. Governesses like Deborah lived in a strange intermediate zone, with authority over subordinates but subordination to absent employers, creating opportunities for abuse that could be devastatingly exploited by unscrupulous individuals. Domestic workers occupied a precarious position completely dependent on employers for survival, but without significant legal protections. The grave was so worn that many people passed by it without recognizing it, and maybe that was for the best. Deborah Kearns didn't deserve to be remembered by monuments or ornate markers, only by the historical record of her actions and their consequences. The victims, on the other hand, deserved recognition that was frequently denied them. Those who were interested in dark stories wandered among ancient stones in search of her grave. Was more than just the first name on a list of missing people. She was a young worker with goals and dreams. Ellen Crawford was a principled woman willing to risk everything for justice. Mary Sullivan, as Jacob had mentioned, had family somewhere waiting for news that never arrived. Each name represented a universe of interrupted experiences, relationships, and possibilities. The Appalachian mist keeps its secrets well. There are deep valleys where sunlight barely penetrates. The land where Ashwood once stood is now indistinguishable from so many other empty fields in the rural landscape of West Virginia. Only those who know the history can see beyond the tranquil surface to the shadows that still linger. Perhaps it is fitting that the story ends this way, not with satisfying resolutions or perfect justice, but with a persistent reminder of history. Forests where silence is broken only by wind and wildlife. Deborah Kearns existed, caused great suffering, and ultimately faced the consequences of her actions. Her victims existed, lived real lives, and deserved to be remembered with dignity. That evil can exist under masks of normalcy, that community vigilance matters, and that the courage to bear witness to dangerous truths can mean the difference between justice and continued horror. If you have survived this journey through one of the most unsettling chapters in Appalachian history, thank you so much for your... Stories like this are difficult to tell or hear, but they teach us valuable lessons that last a lifetime. If this in-depth look at dark mysteries and historical cases has piqued your interest, please subscribe to the channel for more stories that delve into the past's forgotten corners. If you enjoyed the research and care that went into reconstructing this story, please leave a like and comment below where you're watching from. Your participation helps us keep bringing these significant stories to light. The subsequent inquiry into the lost records of